Hello everyone and welcome. This will be the first of the set of notes that I'm going to be posting on the web. What I would like for you to do is to write down slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, etc. And on each slide I would like you to write down one or two things that you learned from that slide or that stood out. Basically just some sort of proof that you've actually gone through and listened to this. This will be due the next time we have class. Actually, not the next time we have class. It will be due 2 classes from now. That way it gives students who need to access this information at school a chance to access this. Okay, so today we will be talking about the origins of life. A lot of this is controversial and such. This is where students tend to have the most problems with this unit. Understand that we're talking about where things possibly came from. Everything is a theory, and so that just means it's an explanation. Please don't take any personal offense to anything that you hear here in these notes. I just want you to think about the information and be informed. It is a good thing to be informed and understand at least another point of view, whether you agree with it or not. Today we're talking about the origins of how things became alive, and we will spend this one day on this and not much more. Most of the rest of what we'll be talking about this unit will involve basically things that we can see happening and that we know happen, and a little bit less in the I guess controversial area. So anyways, let's go ahead and get through this and move on to the next slide when you are ready. Okay, if you remember early on in the class, I believe first week, one of the very first section of notes, we talked about spontaneous generation and biogenesis. So what is spontaneous generation? Take a second, maybe write a guess down. This would be a good thing to write down as proof of you listening to this set of notes. So take your best guess at spontaneous generation, and take your best guess at what is biogenesis. I'll give you a few moments to write. Okay, so what is spontaneous generation? Remember, spontaneous is out of nowhere, and generation means to create. And biogenesis means life, and genesis means beginning. Life beginning life. So which is creationism or intelligent design? Is it spontaneous generation or biogenesis? Again, this is another excellent opportunity to write something down. Okay, and hopefully you came up with spontaneous generation. No matter which religion you look at, if you go back and look at it, basically some intelligent being, some superior being, created human beings and all living things out of something. Now, which is evolution? Spontaneous generation or biogenesis? Okay, so here's the deal with this. The book, your textbook, brings this up at this point because its argument is that evolution is biogenesis. In other words, living things coming from other living things. And if you remember the experiments with the meat was put in an open container. You'll see this on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. The meat was put in an open container, and flies landed on it and laid eggs, and then maggots came around. And then you put a cover on the one set of meat, and the flies would come around and lay the eggs on top of what was called cheesecloth, so that way the flies could still smell everything but couldn't actually land on the meat. And so you ended up with maggots on top of the container, but not actually from the meat, so the meat didn't turn into living things. And then Louis Pasteur came along and he boiled some broth and killed all the bacteria in it, and he had the swan-necked flask, which would allow air in there, what they called at the time the life force or the breath of God. And even though air could get in there, no living organisms actually showed up until he tipped the flask sideways and introduced bacteria, and that's the only time you saw microorganisms or saw the rotting of the material in the flask. So that was proof that living things began other living things. But if you think about it, what is actually evolution? And if you go back through evolutionary history, for example, mammals evolved from reptile-like organisms, and reptiles evolved from amphibians, and amphibians from fish, and so on and so forth. And if you go back, you get back to cells. But where did cells come from? And this is where the argument that the book presents is sort of inaccurate. Yes, living things come from other living things, and that's sort of the proof of natural selection. But to say that that's the proof of all of evolution is a little questionable. So we'll talk more about this in class together, but it is a rather interesting argument, and it's, in my opinion, a very faulty argument, but the book does bring it up. So let's go ahead and, we'll talk about it a little bit more in class. Go ahead and move to the next slide when you are ready. Okay, so this is the origins of life according to biological theory. The first thing we're going to have is simple organic compounds. And the idea here is that we're going to have simple things like, not even proteins, but more along the lines of amino acids, simple carbohydrates, simple nucleic acids. And these guys named Urey and Miller ran an experiment to prove this. Their theory is that the early Earth's atmosphere had a lot of carbon dioxide, had a lot of methane, a lot of ammonia, and these are all things that are basic components of organic molecules. But there was no oxygen. That's very important to note. There was no oxygen in early Earth's atmosphere. And the thought was there would also be water. Water has hydrogen and oxygen in it, but it's not oxygen that's an element that's the oxygen that we breathe. And so what Urey and Miller did was they put all of these theoretical early gases that would have been in the Earth's atmosphere, and obviously if there's water vapor there would be rain, and where there's rain there's lightning and thunder, and so they put some electrodes in there to simulate the lightning. And if you look at the diagram in the lower right hand corner there, you can see how they had a high voltage source and attached it to electrodes, and that would have had all those chemicals I talked about. Methane, which is carbon and hydrogen. Ammonia, which is nitrogen and hydrogen. Remember, nitrogen is very important for amino acids and proteins. There would have been carbon dioxide there, again having carbon and oxygen's found in all organic molecules, and then water, also hydrogen and oxygen found in all organic molecules. And so what they did is they then zapped these chemicals to simulate the lightning, and what they did then was they ended up with these chemical compounds that were basically simple chemical compounds, amino acids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. The problem is they were simple chemical compounds, and that's as far as Urey and Miller could get. They couldn't get to the complex compounds like proteins. One thing the textbook mentions in some current thought is that maybe clay caused these molecules to stick together, so you'd have two amino acids stuck next to each other to a little bulb of clay, and that would cause them to force them to form together into proteins, which, if you remember our discussions about protein synthesis, is actually way more complex than that. So at this point, that's sort of like as much information as we can come up with. There's still a big hole in the theory. They're not sure how you'd go from these simple chemical compounds to more complex ones. For example, simple carbohydrates like sugars and make complex carbohydrates like starches. How did we get to that point? How would you go from simple nucleic acids to DNA? And there's a lot of questions about that. The other thing is that these organic molecules would have formed these little pools, and they would basically be kind of like chicken soup. And if you think about this at this point, go back to our discussion about spontaneous generation and biogenesis. Is chicken soup living? Obviously not. And so at this point, we don't have something that's living. Okay, go ahead and move on to the next slide when you're ready. The next thing we would have are what are called protocells. I think of these more like little snot bubbles. Basically, bubbles. Are bubbles living? Well, no, they're not living, and neither are protocells. They're little bubbles of lipids that contain organic molecules. And can bubbles get larger? Yes. Can living things get larger? Yes. But they don't carry out the complex processes that we actually see in a true cell. So yeah, they grow and divide like a bubble would, but they don't actually reproduce, I guess you could say. They don't have protein synthesis. And so these are not considered living. They have recreated these protocells in laboratory experiments, and that's about it. So go ahead and move on to the next slide when you are ready. And now we get to the first true cells. So again, chicken soup, not living. Bubbles in your chicken soup, not living. But now we have true cells, so now we have living. So most likely these guys were anaerobic heterotrophs. Why would these guys be anaerobic heterotrophs? Go ahead and write something down. Okay, these guys would have been anaerobic because, if you remember back to Urey and Miller's experiments, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and anaerobic means without oxygen. And remember, these guys are very similar to archaeobacteria, which we haven't talked about what archaeobacteria are yet, but archaeobacteria are bacteria that do live on the earth today, and they live in really crazy hostile environments, like near volcanic vents and such. So the early Earth's atmosphere, very hostile, not very friendly, lots of volcanoes and such, and so these bacteria that would have lived there would be very similar to today's archaeobacteria, or ancient bacteria. Okay, go ahead and move on to the next slide when you are ready. Okay, the next thing that would happen would be photosynthesizing prokaryotes, and we'll get to how we got photosynthesizing prokaryotes next, but these are what we call cyanobacteria. Sometimes they're referred to as blue-green algae, but they're not really algae, and we'll distinguish next unit what the difference between bacteria and algae are. But basically, bacteria are prokaryotic, meaning they do not have a nucleus. So the first cells didn't have a nucleus, the archaeobacteria, and neither do these guys. These guys would produce oxygen, and that would change the atmosphere. The real reason that they think they moved in this direction is because this would be an advantage. Think about it. Everything else around it is eating other, bacteria, eating other bacteria, eating the primordial soup that they live in. And this is a way of making your own food, so it would be a way of avoiding competition. You can exploit a food source. The other ones, they run out of soup to eat, they're done. They're going to die. Whereas these things can actually just absorb some sunlight and make their own food. They produce oxygen, and that changes the atmosphere, which now paves the way for aerobic bacteria. Now, why would there be an advantage for aerobic bacteria? Go ahead and write your answer down. Just remember some things to keep in mind. Now there's oxygen in the atmosphere because of the photosynthesizing prokaryotes. Remember, prokaryotes means without a nucleus. There's oxygen now in the atmosphere, and why is it so much better to be an aerobic bacteria than an anaerobic bacteria? So write something down. Okay, so aerobic bacteria. Aerobic bacteria uses oxygen, and if you remember earlier in the year, we discussed when you use oxygen, you produce a heck of a lot more ATP, or the energy source that the cells use. And so this is an advantage because these guys can outcompete, outgrow the other types of bacteria that are not able to use oxygen. All right, move on to the next slide when you're ready. Okay, this theory, the endosymbiont theory, is now how we're going to go from our prokaryotic organisms to now eukaryotic organisms. Remember, eu means true, karyos means nucleus. Actually, it means nut, because the nucleus looks like a nut, according to early scientists. I don't see it. But anyways, so these guys now have a nucleus, and remember, things with a nucleus also have these membrane-bound organelles. And so the idea here is that some of these organisms would eat smaller organisms. So if you look at the diagram there's a little thing with a nucleus, and it comes along and gobbles up this little aerobic bacteria. And the idea is that instead of digesting it, at some point in time, these organisms realize that, hey, I'm better off with just keeping some of these organisms living inside of me, and they help me break down food more efficiently, because the one all the way to the left has no ability to use oxygen, but if it lets this little critter live inside of it, like in the middle two diagrams where it's eating it and then they're just living inside of it, it can now break down food more efficiently and produce a heck of a lot more ATP, the energy, by having the critter living inside of it. Now, it seems like a bit of a stretch because you never looked at a hamburger and thought, well, gee, it'd be an advantage for it to be part of me. Well, remember, these things are little single-celled organisms, so they don't have brains. And there is some proof behind this, because the mitochondria that we have today have ring-like DNA that's very similar to the DNA that we see in prokaryotic organisms. So, anyways, eating these little bacteria that use oxygen and letting them basically become a symbiotic relationship, which again, remember back to the first unit of this year, we talked about symbiosis being a close relationship, in this case a mutualistic relationship where the mitochondria or the prokaryotic bacteria would have protection, and the outer eukaryote would then get more energy and then provide that protection. And so that's how we believe, or biology believes, that we end up with eukaryotic organisms with mitochondria in it. Move on to the next slide when you're ready. Not much to say here. This is just a closer look at the endosymbiont theory and how we got mitochondria. Go ahead and move on to the next slide when you're ready. Now here we can see where it's gobbling up little blue-green algae, or little photosynthesizing prokaryotes. And in the previous theory, that's how we would have got animal cells, but here's how we would have got plant cells. Now this guy gets an even more of an advantage, because now he can not only can he use oxygen to burn energy more efficiently, he can use these little bacteria that are, the cyanobacteria, the photosynthesizing bacteria, to make his own food and use oxygen to produce a lot more energy. And so this is how we would have ended up with algae and plant cells. Go ahead and move on to the next slide when you are ready. Again, this is just another little diagram of the endosymbiont theory and how we would have ended up with different type of algae and different types of organisms. And all these things way over on the right here are different versions of what we call protists. And protists are organisms that we'll talk about next unit, but in a real brief summary, they are basically, some of them are very similar to animal cells, and some of them are very similar to plant cells. And this is everything for this section of notes. If you have any questions, just send me an email or let me know in class.